All right, all right. Greetings, 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 everyone. Hoping all of you are maintaining your best spiritual wealth as much as you can. Hopefully, you are maintaining your best physical and ideological wealth and health as well. It is our pleasure to present tonight's Our Ancestors' Voices, where we focus on the life and radical legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. You all are aware of the fact that Our Ancestors' Voices is sponsored every weekend by the All African People's Revolutionary Party. And we are not missing a beat, even though we are one short comrade this evening. We are so happy to report that a majority of our comrades have made it safely home to the continent, to Guinea-Bissau, and they have already kicked off the opening events of the first party-wide Congress ever. So we're just so excited. This is a monumentous occasion for the All African People's Revolutionary Party. We're so excited for our comrades who are doing that work at home on ground. We are going to continue no matter what, because we understand that the work is never done and we need to continue making a difference as much as we can so that we can continue building this party and making it so that Africans everywhere can be free and that colonized people everywhere can be free and have their land back. So I'm so excited. I think I've got the streaming thing set. So if you are on Zoom and you are able to confirm for me that you are also hearing me on Facebook, that would be spectacular. But I think on YouTube, I am good to go. So we're going to continue. And I just ask for you all's patience tonight. This is my first time doing all of this at one time. So I'm sure I'm going to make mistakes, and I just ask for your understanding and your patience. If you are in work study or a part of the All African People's Revolutionary Party and you see questions popping up in the comments section, especially if you are not on Zoom, but even if you are, please help me out, because I can only do so much and it's going to be really difficult for me to watch the comments and try to continue with the slides and make sure that we end on time tonight. So I have a lot on my plate and I'm asking for your help as much as possible. Again, if you are a member of Work Study or a member of the All African People's Revolutionary Party and you are able to step in, especially if you see a question pop up in the comments section that you can answer, please feel free to take that from me, especially if you are not on Zoom. If you are on Zoom and questions pop up, please feel free to help me out. I'll do the best I can to monitor the Zoom comments. But as you all know, I do not have a Facebook account, so that's going to be close to impossible for me. And I'm doing the best I can to monitor YouTube, but I'm also hearing an echo. So I had to turn that off just so I could hear one voice and be able to move forward. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. We, of course, want to start off by paying homage to our indigenous ancestors and family and comrades. Without them, we would not be here, literally, because this land, we understand, is their land. And we understand that until they get their land back, no indigenous, African, Palestinian, Asian descent, or even Irish descent person can be free, because if one of us has our land being taken from us, then that unfortunately has a ripple effect that affects all of us as well. And we understand that because we are in a socialist organization that has the intention behind raising consciousness so that we one day can use socialism to advance the conditions of Africa as one unified socialist Africa, with the understanding that we're not going to be operating off of 53 different countries. We plan for Africa to be free and to have access and control over how the resources are being spent, disseminated, used, sold, bartered, exchanged, and all of that will be based on a socialist economic system, not based on capitalism, because we understand that capitalism is not the answer that we need. Capitalism is actually the reason that we are in the predicament that we are currently in. So we understand that that means that indigenous people need to have their land back too. And as I said earlier, that means that Palestinian people need to have their land back. Asian descent people who have been colonized need to have their land back. Irish descent people need to have their land back. And of course, Africans, we need our land back too. And so with that, I've mentioned to you before that Our Ancestors' Voices is sponsored by the All African People's Revolutionary Party. We are humbled to bring you this broadcast every weekend, Sunday nights or Sunday mornings, depending on when you're listening to it. We also are live streaming through YouTube as well as Facebook. So please make sure that you put your information in the chat if you're interested in joining those other channels that are being streamed. But otherwise, feel free to continue spreading the word and bringing more people to join and come with us so that we can continue to build up the organization for colonized people everywhere, to build up the organization for African people so that we can get access to our land back. I mentioned before, and I'll say it again, the All African People's Revolutionary Party, or the AAPRP, is an independent, mass, Pan-African political party that is based in Africa. I always love saying that because I think it's important to note that we are based out of the continent of Africa. We are not based out of any other part of the world. We understand that our problems started at home on the continent. And so we understand that we need to do work on the continent in order to fix and address said problem. We also understand that because everything that we have come to understand is based on the baseline of Africa, this is precisely why the first Pan-African Congress event has taken place also on the continent of Africa. And so with that, we want to work more in terms of connecting those countries that I talked about, helping those different countries to resist neocolonialism, to resist separatist ways and behaviors, to resist understanding that they need to be elite compared to one another because maybe the French colonized this country and the Portuguese colonized that country. We want to eradicate all of that and just make it so that we are all unified, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you speak Portuguese and it doesn't matter if I speak French. We're all Africans. And we are all suffering at the hands of the French and the Portuguese. So we need to rise up. We need to organize against the French, the Portuguese, the British, the Spanish, anybody who thinks that they can have access to African resources. And we need to kindly or violently escort them out of our continent because they no longer need to be there. They are taking up space. They are not welcome. And it is our responsibility to do that. But we can't do that without first understanding the herstory and the theirstory and the history of how we can go about doing that. So we have our ancestors who have paved the way for us. And that's why it's important to join an organization that's working for justice so that you can start to equip yourself with information, political information, or what we call political education, so that you can start to become more aware of how our ancestors have fought to do the very same thing, who also believed in Africa being one unified socialist Africa. So we're talking about Amilcar Cabral, we're talking about Kwame Nkrumah, we're talking about Sekou Touré, we're talking about Kwame Touré, we're talking about comrades that have since left this earth physically and deceased, but their spirit lives on. And we're also talking about comrades that are still living to this day, still organizing with the All African People's Revolutionary Party and organizing with our sibling organizations like the Pan African Congress of Azania and the PAIC and the PAIGC, these different organizations that are founded in Guinea-Bissau and in Azania, which we unfortunately are colonized to understand as South Africa. All these different organizations working together, again, on the continent with the AAPRP so that we can regain access and control of how we use these resources and how we connect and break down any walls and barriers that have separated us. So we want to pay homage to the Handbook of Revolutionary, Nkrumah's Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare that you see on the right. And we also want to acknowledge that our comrade Ajamu is safely in Guinea-Bissau doing the work that needs to be done. And we want to continue to wish them and any other comrades well as they are doing that work at the first party of Congress that I mentioned. But this is us, and we're going to continue here on this front. And we wish Ajamu well. And when he returns, he's actually going to give us a report out of his time there and what they discussed and how the first party of Congress went. And so stay tuned for that. More details to come. That'll actually be the following weekend, not this upcoming Sunday, but the weekend after that, he will be back to talk about that. So without further ado, we're going to jump into it and get started. So as I said, tonight is all about the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, and specifically the radical life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. So we want to start with this discussion by stating loud and clear that whatever your thoughts and beliefs about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whether you agree with him 100% or you don't agree with him at all, No one can dispute that he was a man of principle. Even with the most militant Black Power activists at that time, those who were opposite to King on many issues, like Kwame Ture, formerly known as Stokely Carmichael, or Cleve Sellers, Mukasa Dada, formerly known as Willie Ricks, all of them agree that King was an honest man. This is important because a person of principle may take a while to change positions on a critical topic, but their commitment to doing what's right, the very definition of dignity and principles, ensures that eventually they will come around to the correct position. And for a person of principle, this means they will do so despite whatever personal consequences result from their decision to do what is right. To understand the complexities of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., you have to start by understanding that he was a person of principle who, unlike so many of these so-called Christians today, he understood clearly that a dedication to God cannot be separated from the commitment to do what is right. If you all will give me 1 second, I just need to double check something here. All right, okay. Appreciate you all's patience. Okay. So I now have it set up where I have a co-host here to help me out. So thank you, co-host. I appreciate you coming in. All right. So as I was saying, King understood clearly that a dedication to God cannot be separated from a commitment to do what is right, regardless of the consequences. Had Dr. King lived longer than a mere 39 years, we would certainly have been able to witness him taking much more radical positions on a number of critical issues, because any principled person who genuinely explored any issue will become more radicalized around that issue. And I think that's so important to highlight. I mean, this comrade was 39 years old, you all, when he was murdered and taken away from this earth. And it's really amazing that in 39 years, he was able to develop such a unique lens of Pan Africanism, which is, of course, why he had to be shot and killed, right? And so we're going to talk in a lot more detail about that in the upcoming slides, but I just think it begs the question. This is why we need to continue to understand the importance of joining an organization that's working for justice, but also understanding why committing to principles is always going to be so, so, so important. This is especially true as it relates to understanding the contradictions of this oppressive capitalist system. And again, when you join an organization that's working for justice, 9 times out of 10, your organization is also focusing on how oppression has impacts on people, whether you're focusing on poverty, whether you're focusing on health disparities, whether you're focusing on why some people are not able to pay their bills in a timely manner, or maybe you're focusing on the fact that a certain group of people who live in a certain zip code continue to have health issues compared to other people in other parts of the city. Whatever your focus is, you have to always tie it back to capitalism, because unfortunately, that is a system that doesn't value people, but instead puts money before people and ensures that private entities continue to profit no matter what, even if it's at the expense of other people dying from cancer or heart disease, or whether they have smoking addictions or whatever the case may be. And so King understood that and started to focus more and more on that, which also spoke to the humanitarianism that he had within himself. King never got the opportunity to advance on all pertinent issues, but he clearly demonstrated his willingness to go against the grain on issues of principle. For example, against the urgings of the US government leaders, King established a relationship with the Ghanaian president, Kwame Nkrumah, upon Ghana's independence in March of 1957. And I'm going to talk in more detail about this in the upcoming slides, but it's really important to note that immediately, you all, that King was not afraid of going home. He was not afraid of understanding that there was actually a connection between being in Ghana or on the continent of Africa and seeing how problems that lay out with Africans who were resisting colonialism were also similar to problems that lay out in Harlem with Africans. Africans were dealing with racism in Atlanta, and he saw that. Africans were dealing with literally dying on the job, which is what brought him to Memphis, Tennessee, which also spoke to their lack of agency and poverty, right? And how, well, they're just poor sanitation workers, so it doesn't matter that one of them died. Like, all of these are common denominators that he saw affecting Africans everywhere. And so King understood the importance of connecting those dots. The US government officials were working overtime to assassinate, overthrow, and discredit Kwame Nkrumah. And they pressured King to discontinue his relationship with Nkrumah, to which King refused. He said, no, I'm not going to do that. Again, this is a man of principle, right? That's where that comes from, because King understood that Nkrumah not only wanted what was best for Africans, not just in Ghana, because it's about Pan Africanism, it's about connecting all the countries together for one unified socialist Africa, but Nkrumah was working overtime to make it so that Africans everywhere could benefit from this socialist continent that was brewing and growing from all the work that was being done. And King started to get a real thrill of that. He started to understand that. And again, he was connecting the dots, and he was seeing it wasn't just Harlem. It wasn't just Memphis. It wasn't just Georgia. Africans everywhere were under attack. And he was starting to connect those dots and to see that. In fact, Nkrumah remained a confidant and mentor to King until King's assassination in 1968. Also, the U.S. power structure pushed through the so-called establishment of civil rights organizations during the 1960s, and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, under the national leadership of Roy Wilkins, and the National Urban League under the leadership of Whitney Young, pressured King to denounce Black power as a viable and legitimate movement. King struggled because of his commitment to nonviolence as a principle and his liberal capitalist orientation up to that point, but ultimately he refused to denounce the most radical element of the civil rights movement, and until his death, he remained a trusted, if not debated, comrade to all sectors of the African movement for justice and forward progress. And this begs the question in terms of thinking about what were some of the driving forces that allowed him to take the stances that he took. You see the pictures on the slide, if you're on Zoom or even on YouTube, of in the upper left corner of Martin Luther King and Kwame Nkrumah in the upper left. You see that. And of course, we know that King was starting to develop his relationship with Malcolm. And we know that the two had contradictions. We know that they were called out. And we know that they both talked publicly about those contradictions. But we also know, if we've done our research and if we have truly enhanced our political education, then we also know that both King and Malcolm were both starting to develop a Pan-African lens. And that is so important, because a lot of times, especially if you grew up in the diaspora outside of the continent, then you were force-fed to think and only prioritize the conditions of Africans living in the US. And that becomes a problem, because that means that you don't have to think about how these problems are affecting Africans everywhere. These are global problems affecting Africans, and it develops this separatist ideology. More than that, it develops a class ideology where you start to think that your problems as a quote unquote US citizen are more important than those in Haiti, or are more important than those in Barbados or Jamaica or even parts of Africa. And again, that's problematic. That's problematic beyond measure, because you would have nothing without Africa. Africa gave you everything if you identify as an African. And so I think that's really important to think about that, because that's why we need to continue to connect the dots. That's why we need to continue to travel and to connect with other people and to do as much as we can in terms of understanding where we come from, because then we're going to be able to know where we need to go, right? And so, when speaking on US imperialism, King was devoted time after time, and he had numerous struggles with members of the infamous Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, because they were in agreement with the Vietnam War, and King understood the contradictions behind that. And he started raising more of those contradictions and helping other people to see this is not the road that we need to take where we support this war. We actually need to speak out against it, and we need to talk about how this is a hypocrisy. And we need to highlight that this is not something that we should be focused on or infatuated with, right? And we think of all these different examples about how even people in Vietnam, when they would speak to African soldiers, they would tell them, like, African, you need to leave. This is not your war. And so King was taking on that position and helping to raise more consciousness around that. He risked being unpopular by many because of the different conversations he was having to highlight the contradictions surrounding the war. And we know of so many other comrades who have taken positions where they publicly are not supporting the war, or they are refusing to be drafted. And of course, the penalty is being arrested on the other side of that. And so just thinking about how those people taking those risks have allowed us to understand why it's okay to be critical. Yeah, you might be, quote unquote, harassed, or you might be quote unquote penalized, and you might get arrested. But the other part of that is, if you stand for nothing, you'll fall for anything. And again, we're talking about committing to principles, right? And so the speech on April 4th, 1967, quote, "Why I oppose the war in Vietnam," end quote, that's what gave King the foundation and helped a lot of people to understand why he was rooted in the anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist stance. The consequences of this speech included publicly securing reason for his death sentence. So that made it very difficult, because then it was kind of a shoo-in, or a consent, if you will, that, okay, now we understand that this African, he can't live anymore. He needs to be taken care of, because he's making people think too much. And if we have too many people thinking, then they're going to start to raise questions, and we can't have that. And so thinking about that, they tried to pressure him. They did everything they could with King to make him see that he needed to release his integrity. He needed to denounce his approaches with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and their campaign called the, quote, "Smash the Draft" campaign. They begged him, and they even pressured King. They forced him. They tried to threaten him. They did everything they could to get him to denounce it and to really overturn the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And he refused to do it. He refused to do it. He refused to stand against, he refused to stand down. He still agreed with the Smash the Draft campaign. And ultimately that committed to the principle of him understanding that we need to understand that this is not our war, and we need to stand up against it. And this is really when you start to see the radicalization of him starting to metamorph and starting to change, because I'd noticed throughout his career with different organizations, he was really starting to develop his ideology on a higher level. And I know that sounds kind of obvious, but that's precisely my point, is the more exposure he had to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or to the sanitation workers or the Poor People's Campaign, all of these different organizations started influencing him and his decisions, because they started giving him more information to play with and to start to manipulate and to think about in his brain. And so then he started making different decisions based off of his exposure to these organizations. And so, we have to think about in more context what that really looks like. And again, like, why is it so important to join an organization working for justice? Well, for one, it kind of gives you some exposure that you may not have otherwise have had. A lot of us may not see how different we are from MLK, or we may not see how similar we are to MLK. But this brother was born in Atlanta, Georgia, you all. Like, a lot of us do not have to be these amazing leaders who were born in some amazing place. A lot of us can be born just wherever we were born, and we can still decide to become the people that we want to become. I always think of the story of my dad, where he talked about how when they were looking for a leader to take on the Montgomery bus boycott, Dr. King was in the back of the room, and I don't even think he had turned the age of 20 yet. I think he was maybe like 16, 17. He had just graduated from college, and he was in the back of the room just eating a sandwich. And somebody was in the front at the podium talking on the microphone, and they were, talking about the candidate and the qualifications that person would need to have to lead the people and to help get this off the ground. And there were so many people recommending people, but nobody was stepping up to actually take on that position. And they pointed to the back of the room and they said, "You." And King was like, "No, I just want to eat my sandwich." But he understood that it wasn't just about him. He understood that there were other people who were going to be strongly impacted by this very large bus boycott, that they still to this day do not understand how deeply impacted it made on a national and global level. Right? To this day, we still think about the impacts of that. And so I think that those are the kind of things that we have to think about in terms of how a person becomes more radicalized, is understanding that you can be born in Atlanta, you can be born in Haiti, you can be born in Germany, you can be born in Ghana, but you have a choice on joining an organization that's working for justice, and then increasing your political education so that you can understand that you have a responsibility to make a difference for everybody around you. You have to make that choice within yourself. You have to separate the fact that the system we live in teaches us to be selfish on a regular basis. You have to separate that, okay? You have to first understand it and then separate it. And then you have to understand that it's your responsibility to do what other people are needing you to do, because that will allow you to be a better person for the world to come, right? And it's helpful to think about it in that way, because then if you start to, again, separate what other people are expecting of you and separating what you are expecting of other people, and you start to think about those who need your help but aren't in a position to do so, then you might start to use your skills a little bit differently, because you're understanding that it's not just about you. You're understanding that there's a whole world out there of people who could strongly benefit from your skill set, because everybody, all of us have different unique skills that help advance the people in our struggle, right? But we have to make a decision to want to change that. And it starts with understanding that we can't change it by ourselves. That's what it starts with. So, if we're thinking more about how King was starting to unpack capitalism, capitalist propaganda teaches you, and it teaches me to believe that King believed that there was so much nonviolence and there were actions that were nonviolent that he needed to practice at all hours of his life, and he never once needed to defend himself. He also could not ever be violent, even if violence was bestowed upon him. That's what capitalism will teach us. And if we allow it to, again, because we don't know our political education and we don't know right from wrong, then we're going to have to just follow that. But if you actually can enhance your political education and understand what's going on, then you might start to have a better understanding of knowing that King was not just practicing nonviolence, because we have to think about what was going on in his life where he needed to actually consider being violent. And I want to really break that down for a second. I mean, this person was stabbed numerous times, not one time. He was stabbed numerous times. And at least twice that I know of, it was in Harlem, where he was hospitalized in a Harlem hospital. So he was stabbed numerous times. I mean, so if you were stabbed, you wouldn't be violent towards the person stabbing you? Even if you weren't trying to hurt the other person, you wouldn't try to defend yourself while they're constantly stabbing you? Because usually a person being stabbed doesn't just get stabbed one time. It's usually repetitive, because they're trying to really get a hole in your body so that blood can start gushing out, right? So I think it's really important to think about how it would be very hard for you to continue being nonviolent if somebody had tried to stab you just once. And as I said, it was several times for him that he was stabbed. He also had threatening phone calls. I mean, how many times can you answer the phone and just allow somebody to threaten you and your family without you feeling like you needing to take a different approach? That would drive a person crazy, let alone just thinking about that, thinking about how unsafe they may be and knowing that they need to do something different. I also want to highlight that his house was bombed. His house was bombed and his family almost died. I mean, you would have to be really, really incredible if all of those things happened to you and you did not once think about defending yourself or being violent on the person that tried to bring harm to you and your family. I mean, that's incredible. But a lot of us don't have that strong will to be able to do that. Why? Because we understand that the system we live in is unjust. And that same system we live in justified the fact that it was okay for him to be stabbed several times. The fact that it was okay for his house to be bombed and his family almost killed. The fact that it was okay for him to not be able to answer the phone without wondering what threatening phone call that was going to be. I mean, just imagine answering the phone and just hearing someone breathe on the other side, but not saying anything. I mean, how creepy is that? That is really, really creepy. But yet our comrades deal with it all the time. They deal with it all the time. And so King did see nonviolence as a valuable principle, of course, because that's what he started off with, and he was trying to help that to grow. But I think he quickly realized, comrades and family, that we don't live in a nonviolent system. We live in a very violent system. I mean, just think of how America was founded, off the backs of slaves and indigenous people who were raped, who were murdered, and whose lands were stolen from them. That is extremely violent. Extremely violent. And that's how America was founded. So I think it's important for us to understand that King understood, I am trying really hard to walk this way. And it's very difficult for me to continue doing this because I'm not playing fair with my opponents. I really think that that's what King started to understand. And I think that we should understand that King understood that nonviolence was a valuable principle. Of course it is. It can be. It can always be effective, but it just depends on who you're using it against, I think. And I think you have to literally fight fire with fire. Because sometimes you might practice nonviolence with somebody else. And if that's what they're communicating to you, then great, you're going to be great and everything is going to be wonderful. But you have to figure out how to communicate with that other person. And King was trying to develop that. He began to adjust his thoughts on that same principle, that nonviolent principle, because his position over time needed to change. As I said, if you're exposed to all this violence, after a while, you're not going to be able to just still continue practicing nonviolence. That's not going to work. Either that or you're a sitting duck, and you're going to have to do something about your safety at that point. Because if your safety is involved, then that means it's a threat to you and your family. And at that point, you start to think a little bit differently. So we believe that King was able to consistently see that the opposition was not practicing nonviolence with colonized people. And so it begged the question, was the principal tactic truly effective? And again, was it effective in terms of helping King to get where he needed to go? Yes, at some point, yes. But over time, you got to use what you can based on who you're dealing with. And as I said before, just think about if you were stabbed several times. And again, like, what type of system do we live in where they're only teaching us one side of his life? The fact that we have to do this seminar to talk about how radical he was, I think is a problem, because it's selling this false narrative that King was just nonviolent even when harm was being brought to him. And I don't think that's safe to teach people that. I think that's very dangerous, actually. It's very violent, actually, to teach people that, because it's not true. And it's okay for us to learn about what really happened. It's okay for us to understand that King wanted himself, his family, and the people around him to be safe. I wonder why? Well, because he knew that they were trying to make a difference. And I think he knew that he had a lot of work that needed to be done, and he didn't want to leave before it was time for him to do the work he needed to do. So I think that that's incredible. And we really started to see the nonviolent acts and the ideology change just as the organizations he worked with transitioned. I mentioned this earlier. So, we talked about how when King was working with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, he was definitely in a challenged position with a lot of SNCC members who were pro-war. And he was talking to them about why you needed to be anti-war. Well, by the time he joined the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, he had obtained a gun permit. And based on the research that I completed, he had to obtain multiple gun permits because a lot of the county sheriffs that he submitted requests for, specifically in parts of Alabama and Mississippi, they denied him on purpose. And so again, like, just thinking of the racism that he had to experience, where they didn't want him to have a legal gun, because that was one more reason where he may not have been able to get killed sooner, right? And so they were trying to do everything they could to prevent him and to stop him. And so he had to apply for multiple gun permits as an application so that he could finally get what he needed. And again, that was when he started working with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, right? And so it's important to just know, like, what's going on and to understand what's happening. You can be with SCLC and do the work and understand the importance of it, but you also need to understand that you need to be responsible for finding ways to keep you and yourself safe. And we're not just talking about when he was with his family, because we're talking about him being on the road, right? We're talking about him needing to have protection for his family at the house, even when he wasn't there. And he did. He worked out different details with that. He had strong relationships with rejecting his communication and relationships with the Deacons for Defense, for example. There were so many people who encouraged him to look the other way and to reject them and to turn them down, just like they tried to pressure him to turn down the Smash the Draft campaign with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. But he didn't do it. He understood that the Deacons of Defense were actually going to support him in more ways than one, because they were able to not only were they trained professionally with weapons, but they understood the importance of gun safety. They understood the importance of using guns. They were not afraid to use guns, and they understood how to keep people safe. That was literally what they did. That was literally why they existed as an organization. And so King understood that. And he asked Deacon Charles Sims to be his personal bodyguard for a period of time. If I'm not mistaken, there were even bodyguards within the Deacons of Defense who stayed at his house and looked after Coretta and the children when he was out traveling, giving his speeches and whatnot. And so, just continuing to think about that on a larger scale is going to be really helpful, because we must understand that we're not going to be taught this in elementary school or high school or middle school. It's up to us to do this research on our own. It's up to us to pick up as many books as we can that were written by King, yeah, but even books that were maybe written by Kwame Nkrumah, because Kwame Nkrumah speaks about Martin Luther King. Malcolm X talks about King in his speeches. I'm saying to read as many things as we can, you all. That's the point I'm making, so that we can start to get more consistent information, especially from different people, to understand things about people we recognize and respect that we may not have otherwise been taught. And again, relying on the oppressor to teach you about your own background, I mean, that's the most backward things that we ever heard. Like, you can't rely on the master to tell you who you are. If you do, that's really backwards because the master doesn't want you to know who you are, because that means you have more organization and be able to free yourself sooner. And that's not what they want, right? They want us to continue to be enslaved mentally, physically, whatever capacity, as much as possible. So I think it's important for us to continue to think about that, to think about the fact that King was not discouraged. He applied for many gun permits and he was able to get them eventually. We have to think about how he had all these different opportunities to grow as a person again. And then we also think about the different periods of time that he was in these organizations and what was going on in the world that influenced his decisions, right? So at the time, anti-war was a really big thing with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And they were pushing against that because, like I said, there were members of SNCC who didn't see the value in being anti-war. And so King was able to help develop their ideologies on that. By the time he joined the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, it was a different perspective where he understood, not only do I need Deacon Charles Sims with me, but I also need to be trained in firing this weapon, because I'm not really sure that I can, be trained to stab someone or have a taser if tasers were around back then. I need to have a gun because that's what other people have, and they're aiming to shoot first and kill me. And I need to be aware of that. I need to be aware that this is how I'm going to stay safe. And for all we know, I don't know if it was documented, but for all we know, he wanted Coretta to be trained and he applied for Coretta to have a gun permit. I mean, these are the kind of decisions that a lot of our comrades have had to make because they wanted to keep their families safe. And so, we just have to think about that on a larger scale, because I think that's going to be really important. And like I said, we're not being educated about this part. So it's up to us to educate ourselves. It's up to us to teach ourselves about these details that so conveniently were left out, right? Because we need to know and we need to teach other people about it so that we can have a better understanding of what's going on. I also think it's important for us to think about this because, again, I'm trying to help draw the connections where a lot of us still have not joined organizations that are working for justice. And we may think that, well, Dr. King was this amazing person and I'm just me. No, King, as I said, was born in Georgia and didn't even want to lead the bus boycott, but he was called upon to do it because the people asked him to do it. So what really separates him from any of us? Nothing. He just was able to understand that he had a responsibility to his people. And the sooner that we understand that, the better, because then we can start to grow and use our skills to help other people, as I said. And so continuing with that, we want to talk more about how his expansion for his work was really starting to grow. And so, just thinking about cities like Chicago, the work that he was doing in Chicago was growing his support and understanding that the problem was larger than racial segregation. He started to make sense of the fact that economic systems, and specifically systems that are designed to promote wealth of private entities over humanity, like capitalism, he started to have a better understanding of how those type of programs were not going to help at all with what was going on, because we needed to have a better way of taking down capitalism so that poor people did not have to be harmed in the process of us developing a society where everyone could matter. And so he understood that economic systems were based on exploitation and oppression. And that same system that was based on exploitation and oppression was the same reason that these problems were happening. It was the same reason that people were facing these kind of problems. This understanding of capitalism, imperialism, that became even more clear when King was invited, again, as I spoke earlier, by Kwame Nkrumah in March of 1957. And he went to Ghana and he took Coretta with him. They both went. And I think it's so important that we talk about that because, again, This is somebody who was born in Atlanta, Georgia, you all, and decided very early on, I'm going to join these organizations and I'm going to try my best to make a difference for the people around me. And with each organization, he grew as a person. That's exactly what happens when you're in an organization, is you're able to develop more, you're able to take more in, you start to understand things. And as I said earlier, then you start connecting things, because if you read one thing that was written by somebody, 9 times out of 10, if you start reading more things, other people are going to start to connect what you've already read. And then the information gets stronger because you have more reinforcements, right? That are saying the same thing that you've already been exposed to. And so King was able to experience that when he went to Ghana and met Nkrumah. He was able to understand that fighting for colonialism is not different from fighting from racist tactics that take place in the US. And more importantly, he started to understand that Africans everywhere are dealing with colonization, just like Africans in the US are dealing with racism, white supremacy. And he started to really draw in that these are problems that we need to face head on. These are not problems that we need to face individually. He also understood that these were not problems that could be fixed just with the groups that were experiencing them. We needed to all come together to help to resist that. And so I'm so excited that he was able to experience that, because I think it's really important for us to talk about how this person that grew up in Georgia understood that joining organizations was going to help him understand more about the world. And that allowed him to develop a Pan-African lens as he developed this idea that you can have nonviolence, but you need to build on that and use that to your advantage. If the person you're dealing with is being violent, then maybe you can't practice nonviolence with that person. And as I said before, our opposition has been nothing but violent since we came into this country unwillingly and unconsented. This country has been nothing but violent with us. And so just thinking about that on a larger scale, that was really important for King when he was able to get to Ghana and to see the struggles that were taking place. And keep in mind, he was able to get to Ghana right after the bus boycott. So, just trying to pull in the connections between everything and helping people see the connections and see the importance of it was really key in doing that. And so I want to also say that that's where King was able to really start to put together that it's important to start to do work with as many different locations as possible. So I mentioned that he was doing work in Chicago, and a lot of people know this, but just in case you don't, he was he was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, on April 4th, 1968. But what brought him to Memphis in the first place? He came because he was working with the Poor People's Campaign. There was a sanitation worker who was killed on the job. And we know that sanitation, the discipline of sanitation, I should say, or the work and organization of sanitation has developed over time. But back in the day, it used to be a very dangerous job, picking up trash and managing the sanitation that needed to take place. And so, unfortunately, there was a person who was killed on the job as a sanitation worker, and the workers were asking for different labor conditions where they could have more protection and have more insured protection, which is a justifiable request. For those of us that are listening that are pro-union, we understand that they were trying to ask for more protection on the job and to have more benefits and more rights as workers, because they shouldn't have to risk their lives every day and not have any guarantee that the companies can do more to keep them safe so that more people don't die doing their work as sanitation workers, right? And so they asked King to come and help because they weren't getting anywhere. And when they asked for different labor conditions, and when they asked for more personal protection equipment, and when they asked for more infrastructures to change so that they wouldn't necessarily be killed on the job, they didn't get the response that they were looking for. They weren't taken seriously. The companies laughed at them and didn't value them. And why? Because a lot of these people were poor. And so the companies didn't feel like they needed to respect them. On top of that, a lot of these people were colonized and of color. And that was another reason why these companies didn't feel like they needed to be respected. And so I think it's important to mention that, because due to the work of the sanitation workers, that's what brought King to Memphis in the first place. And so, most people miss that the whole reason King came was to be of service to someone else. It was very anti-capitalist for him to take the actions that he took. And we don't really think about that, because That's not really how we're breaking everything down, but there was nothing that could motivate him to come. He had no ties here. He had no reason to be here except for the fact that he understood that he might be able to speak on their behalf. He might be able to, draw some attention and help to get some other folks to understand why this is such an important thing. I mean, you would think that a person dying would get all the attention that it needed, but, unfortunately, people didn't really see that as a priority. And so having King come here, or maybe people did see it as a priority, but having him come because he was such a big name at that time, that was the icing that they needed for the cake for it to really start to develop into what they needed it to be. And so, we have to think about that and continue to think about how there was more processes that needed to take place. And, again, I mentioned to you that King was 38 when he was taken. I mean, he was 38. And so it's really a trip to me, because for some of us, we're in our 30s now, and we're already thinking about like, what kind of effects have we had on the world? Like, how have we impacted people? How have we treated people to make them know that we value them? Like, I don't know about you all, but in the party, I'm taught that all the time. Like, how you treat people matters. My parents raised me to believe that. They raised me to understand that, it's up to me to not have expectations of people, but instead to try to see how I can provide things, so that how I can make things better, and not to take necessarily, but to try to offer, to try to give as much as possible, because we all have a place, we all have a part to play, and we all have a place in this world and a responsibility in terms of making it better. None of us should be on this earth and just be taking. All of us should be contributing as much as we can to see how we can make it better, because the conditions of this world don't have to be as horrible as they are. We all can change them, but it's up to us to change them. It's up to us to speak out against that. It's up to us to admit that we don't want the circumstances to be what they are. We want to change them. We want to grow. We want to help people to grow. We want the world to be better for our children. We want the world to be better for people that have children, even if we decide not to have children. We should want the world to be better for any one of us, because we deserve better. We deserve better. We don't deserve the nonsense that is existing currently. We don't deserve that, but it starts with being humane. It starts with acknowledging other people. We talk all the time about how when you get to the stoplight, are you one of those people that ignores the shelterless person who's to the left of you if you are privileged enough to have a car, and you just don't even look at them? Or do you actually acknowledge them? And whether or not you have something to give them or not, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm just talking about, do you acknowledge them as another human being? That's all I'm asking right now. Rhetorical, of course, but that's the question we ask, because the minute you stop ignoring them, the minute you start ignoring them, that's when you start to lose your humanity. When you start ignoring other people that are near you, that's when you start to lose it. And it's probably a possibility that you can regain your humanity, but why would you want to lose it to begin with? That's literally what makes you compassionate. That is literally what makes you a decent person. That is literally what we're going to need in order to get Africa free and to change the conditions for other colonized people. Because we don't want to just get Africa free for Africans. We want to make it so that Palestine can be taken back by the Palestinians. And we want to help our Asian comrades get their land back. We want to help our Irish folks get their land back. We want to help anybody who is impoverished and suffering from poverty. We want to affect them immediately and help them, because they should not have to live in a world where because they don't have money, they're not taken seriously. I mean, that is horrible, to live a world like that. It's horrible to not know where your next meal is going to come from because you don't have consistent income. And it's horrible to be treated a certain way because of how much money you make. That is horrible, and that is unacceptable. And so we understand that that means that we need to change some things about that, you all. We understand that that's not going to be decent. We think about King and how he wasn't a revolutionary, but we had to give him time. He was taken way too soon. As I said, he was barely starting to develop his Pan-African lens before he was assassinated. Can you imagine how much of an amazing leader he would have continued to be had he continued on? He probably would have been at the first party of Congress now. He probably would have been a member of the All-African People's Revolutionary Party. Maybe. We don't know. We'll never know what the rest of his life was supposed to be like, because he was killed way too soon. And so, we have to think about how some of us are thinking that we are so different from King, and we're really not. We have more similarities than we think, but it all bases on, you know, what kind of choices we make. How humane do we want to protect ourselves, our humanity? How much of our humanity do we want to protect? Do we want to understand the value of how we can make a difference and help other people? Do we want to remember that we have a responsibility to help make a difference for other people? Or do we want to just live selfishly and just only think about ourselves? I mean, that doesn't really work for me. If that works for you, then I wish you the best. But for those of us who understand that that's not what we need to do in this world, I appreciate that, because that means that you understand that you need to think about me. And that means I understand that I need to think about you. And that means that we're always going to be able to continue if we all continue to remember that it's not just about us. Our ancestors didn't have that thought process. Our ancestors knew that it wasn't about them. And that's why some of them jumped over the ship, because they didn't want to die without being able to control their circumstances. They wanted to die on their terms because they still had understood that they were still contributing to the legacies to come. Some of our ancestors didn't make it over the ship, but when they got to their locations, they found a way to escape. Or when they got to their locations, they found a way to get their children out, even if they couldn't escape. I mean, I start getting emotional when I think about that. When I think about how all of our ancestors knew that they could die in a moment's notice, and they still revolted and they still resisted. Some of them didn't even get on the ship because they were resisting so much. Some of them didn't even leave the slave castle because they were resisting. And if you have a chance to go home, which you should, we talk all the time about how you can still feel some of the scratch marks on the wall when people were literally digging their nails into the walls in Ghana, for example, in Accra, trying not to get out of the wall because the slave masters were pulling them literally. I mean, that's who we come from, though, you all. That's who we come from. And how lucky are we that we come from that? How lucky are we that that's in our backyard? That's our DNA. How lucky are we? I mean, it's just amazing. And so we have a responsibility to continue that. We have a responsibility to continue that. We cannot stop that process. We need to keep that going. Our ancestors deserve better. We deserve to give them more. We deserve to give them much, 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 much more. We need to give them that. We owe them that. We owe them that. And so it's up to us to continue to think about that. And we need to make sure that we do that. Again, I want to point out to you that King is no different from the rest of us. He was born in Georgia. He went to college. Yeah, he was smart. He graduated when he was 16, sure. And for some of us, we've gone the college track. For others, we haven't. But the point I'm making to you is he decided to join organizations that were working for justice. That's something we all can choose to do. But again, it's a choice. As he joined these different organizations, he started letting those organizations influence his decisions. And each decision was contingent on the last organization and experience that he had been in, and that determined what his next choices were going to be. So he continued on, and before you knew it, he had the audacity to actually try to make a difference, to the point where he was able to connect with Kwame Nkrumah, who invited him to come back home. And that's the case in point right there. Once he stepped off the plane and he was able to walk around Ghana, that's when it all started to make sense to him. Talking to Nkrumah, being able to go to these dinners with Kwame Nkrumah, he was able to see firsthand how colonialism has continued to be an issue, and it's no different from the other systems of oppression that Africans are facing in the diaspora. And so again, I encourage you to think about how that's no different from the rest of us. The only difference is he chose not to let go of his humanity. He chose to commit to his principles, and he literally committed to them. He did not let up. I gave you the example about how he did not resist the Smash the Draft campaign. And when they told him to resist the Deacons for Defense and his relationship with them, he said, no, these people are keeping me safe. Why would I discount them? Why would I discredit them? Why would I throw them under the bus? Why would I do that? You don't care about me. They do. And they're keeping me safe. And they would literally take a bullet from me. Would you do that? I mean, this is the person we're talking about. So there's so many things that we can take away from him. And it's up to us to learn more about that so we can grow and try to develop that, you know, in terms of thinking more about what that looks like. And so I appreciate you all hanging out with us today. I think we did okay for the most part. I hope that I didn't miss anything or, try to go too fast or anything. I was trying to pace myself, and we really appreciate you all being with us today. So we hope that you would join us next week on Sunday at the same time, 4 o'clock Pacific, 5 o'clock Mountain, 6 o'clock Central, and 7 Eastern. We're going to be talking next week about Pan Africanism and public health. Okay. I know we've talked a lot about some different health seminars around the time that we have started, but I wanted to take just some basic concepts and still connect them to the level of Pan Africanism and why public health is something that Africans everywhere should benefit from. And it's up to us to think about ways that we can help that become a reality, because we know about health disparities that are affecting our people everywhere. So let's think of some public health ways to address those disparities and to protect our people from getting sick in the future. And so that's what next week's topic is going to be about. We hope that you will come to the AAPRP Forward Ever shop and support. We have our Etsy link is there. You all can purchase these really cool African period shirts, t-shirts, or sweatshirts. They have hoodies, but they also have t-shirts, African period. And you see my dad has the photo there. So literally the words African period. And we were so excited when the Etsy shop opened. I think now it's been about a year and a half, because it was really cool to think about how, you can wear this shirt and it's a conversation starter, right? So, so many of us are still misinformed and saying, African American and things like that. And so, just helping people to understand, no, I'm African, period. Pun intended, right? That's what my shirt says, right? And so just having those different conversations to help people understand that. And so please support that. We also talked about how, some of you all may have already bought a sweatshirt, but don't hesitate, buy more, because that's one of the main ways that we can raise money for the different events that we have going on. And so I actually forgot to put the link on this presentation, but I'll put it for next week. But if you go to the Etsy shop, you can support us. We're actually starting to raise money for all the African Liberation Day event. And then we are also going to be raising money for Pan African Women's Day. Okay, so 2 major events that are coming up. African Liberation Day will be in the month of May, and there will be several events, virtual as well as in person, that you all can participate in. More details to come on that. We've given a couple of seminars specifically that target African Liberation Day. So definitely stay tuned if you missed those, but you can also check them out on the YouTube page. And then we also have Pan African Women's Day, which was a virtual event that we had earlier this year, and we need to raise money for that as well. So usually what I do is we have the links in this presentation at the top of each PowerPoint slide, and you all can just visit the link and go to the AAPRP-INTL.org webpage. So AAPRP-INTL.org webpage. That's the AAPRP International website. And what you do is you click to become a member, and from there, it'll offer you to make a donation. Okay. And so we're asking for donations because, these events, you all, first of all, they are internationally virtually live streamed, which is very expensive. We live stream them on Facebook, YouTube, as well as Zoom. We have to hire interpreters because, as you all know, we're colonized people. So we have people who speak Portuguese, we have people who speak French. And so we have these different interpreters for all these different languages, and they are there with us while the person is speaking in whatever language they're speaking in. They are translating that for those of us who need that translation to understand what's happening. Interpreters are very expensive. We also need to help get some of our comrades to travel. And a lot of times our comrades are on the continent, needing to travel to some of the neighboring countries so that they can be on the ground at the actual event. And so we have several reasons why we need to raise money. And so we ask that you continue to support as much as you can, because that is so important, and we need that support as much as we can. We also stress that if you are not in an organization that is working for justice, if you are not in an organization that is working for justice, that you join one immediately. And even if you need to start one, start an organization that's working for justice. You can also donate at abetterworld.me. That's my dad's webpage, and all that money goes directly to the AAPRP's, I think, Venmo account, if I'm not mistaken. So please make sure you donate through that. And then, don't forget, you all, we celebrate our sibling podcasts and media distribution. So we have our hood communist comrades who are giving out, who are authoring pieces, as well as they have their hood communist live events. So please make sure you go to their website so you can join the Telegram bi-weekly event that takes place. We also have the AAPRP Pontula podcast that takes place on Mondays with our comrades Evan and comrade Jamila. So please check that out. We have the AAPRP Revolutionary African Women. That is the last Saturdays of the month. Make sure you check that out. I want to say that is streamed through Spotify, if I'm not mistaken. And then, of course, we have the Forward Ever broadcast and the AAPRP New Mexico weekly newscast that takes place on Thursdays at 12 noon Mountain Time, okay? So we appreciate you all. I cannot believe, okay, I'm going to get to the comments in just a second, you all, but I cannot believe I finished on time. I'm so excited. Okay. Is that this week Hood Communist Telegram? I have to install Instagram. That is a good question, Glenn. I think if you go to their website, you should be able to find out. But also, I can actually just look on my Telegram app and it'll list it on there and it'll say like when the next broadcast will be. So I'm sure it's on, it may be on Instagram, I'm not sure, but I know Telegram. If you download the Telegram app, you should see it. So yes, definitely, definitely. Awesome. Okay, I'm just trying to catch up on the comments, but we are at time, so I can't catch up on them, and that's okay. Okay, so I appreciate you all. Thank you so much. Be safe. Have a great week. Join an organization that's working for justice. Forward ever, backwards never. Alutua continua. Peace, you all.